The silence was not long unbroken. An ample supply of provisions and abundance of arrack quickly excited the dacoits, who ate and drank immoderately to noisy and vociferous clamor. By degrees, however, the uproar subsided. Sleep overtook the ruffians, who were wearied by days spent on watch before capturing their prisoner. Was it possible he would be left alone thus until the hour of execution? Even though secured by triple cords round breast and arms, incapable of the least movement, would not Nana Sahib place a guard over his victim? While such thoughts passed through the colonel's mind, a dacoit left the barracks and came across the esplanade. This man was appointed to keep watch over the prisoner throughout the night. He approached the gun, and after ascertaining that Colonel Munro's position remained unaltered, he tried the cords with no gentle hand, muttering, 10 pounds of gunpowder! The old gun has not spoken for a long time. Tomorrow she shall say something worth hearing. This remark brought a haughty smile to the lips of the gallant colonel. The most fearful death had no terrors for him. The native then went round the cannon, caressing it with his hand, and resting his finger for an instant on the touch-hole. There he stood, leaning on the breech of the gun, apparently losing all recollection of the prisoner, who remained like a culprit beneath a gibbet, waiting till the fatal bolt be withdrawn. Somewhat affected by the powerful spirit he had been drinking, and utterly indifferent to the awful position of the unhappy prisoner, the Hindu indistinctly hummed the air of an old Hindustani song, breaking off and resuming the tune as a man does when, under the influence of liquor, his thoughts gradually escape control. Presently he stood erect. Again passing his hand all over the gun, he came round it and stopped in front of the colonel, gazing stupidly as he muttered incoherent words. He touched the cords and seemed about to draw them tighter. Then, nodding his head as if reassured, sauntered up to the parapet about a dozen paces off. For 10 minutes he remained there, resting his arms on the top, sometimes glancing round, and then again gazing far down into the abyss at the foot of the fortress. It was plain he was making a last effort against the drowsiness which threatened to overcome him. But at last he yielded, let himself drop to the ground, and there lay stretched, the shadow of the parapet completely hiding him. The night was intensely dark. Heavy clouds hung low and motionless. The atmosphere was still and oppressive. No sound from the valley reached this height. Perfect silence reigned around. For the honor of brave Colonel Munro, we must describe how he spent this terrible night. Not for a moment did he allow his thoughts to dwell on that last moment of his life, now fast approaching, when with rude force his body would be blown to pieces and the atoms scattered far and wide. After all, it would be instantaneous, and such a death had no terrors for a nature on which no moral or physical danger ever had effect. A few hours were still his. They belonged to this life, which for the greater part had been spent so happily. His whole existence passed before him with wonderful exactitude. The image of Lady Munro arose. Once more he saw, he heard that dear one whom he still mourned as in the first days of his bereavement, no longer with tears, but with an ever-aching heart. In his thoughts he returned to the beginning of his acquaintance with her, then a fair young girl living in the doomed town of Cawnpore, in the house where he first admired, knew, and loved her. He lived over again those few years of happiness, suddenly terminated by that most frightful catastrophe. He could recall every word, look, glance of hers with such distinctness that the reality itself could hardly have been more real. Midnight passed without his being aware of it. The present was forgotten by him. Nothing could disturb him in his blissful recollections of his adored wife. In 3 hours he had gone over every day of the 3 years they had spent together. Yes, he was far away in imagination from the plateau and fortress of Rapport, far away from the mouth of that cannon which the first rays of the sun were to fire. But now came that horrible siege of Cawnpore, the imprisonment of Lady Munro and her mother in the Bibigar, the frightful massacre, and lastly the well, the tomb of 200 victims, on which 4 months ago he had wept for the last time. And now that demon, Nana Sahib, was here, only a few yards from him, behind the walls of a ruined barrack. The leader of the massacres, the murder of Lady Munro, and of so many other unhappy beings. It was into this assassin's hands he had fallen, who he had hoped to do justice on the assassin who had hitherto escaped. These thoughts roused Sir Edward. With an impulse of blind anger, he made one desperate effort to free himself. The cords stretched, but the tightened knots cut into his flesh. He uttered a cry, not of pain, but of impotent rage. At the sound, the native raised his head. His senses returned. He remembered that he was guarding the prisoner. He got up and staggered to the colonel, laid his hand on his shoulder to make sure his prisoner was still there, and in a drowsy tone muttered, "Tomorrow, at sunrise." Boom! Then he returned to the parapet as if for support, but no sooner did he touch it again than he lay down and was soon sound asleep. After that one vain effort, calm fell upon Colonel Munro. The course of his thoughts was changed, though not directed to the fate which awaited him. By a natural association of ideas, his mind reverted to his friends, his companions. He wondered whether they had also fallen into the hands of another band of the dacoits who swarm all over the Vindhyas, whether a fate similar to his own might not be reserved for them. The very idea sent a pang through his heart. But then he told himself that such a thing could not be. If the Nabob had wished their death, would he not have united them together in the same punishment, to double his agony by the side of his friends? No, it was on him, and on him alone, this he strove to believe, that Nana Sahib wished to wreak his hatred. Then if Banks, Captain Hood, and Mockler were free, what were they doing? Had they taken the road to Jubalpur, mounted on Behemoth? The dacoits had not been able to destroy him, and he could carry them quickly. Once there, they could soon get help. But what would be the use of it then? How could they find out where the colonel was? No one knew of the fortress of Raipur, the retreat of Nana Sahib. And besides, why should the name of Nabob come into their minds? Did they not believe that Nana Sahib was dead, and that he fell in the attack on the Pal de Tandit? No. They could do nothing for the prisoner. Neither from Gumi could help be expected. Kalagani had had every reason for getting rid of this faithful servant, and since Gumi was not there, it was because his death had preceded that of his master. It was useless to count on even one chance of deliverance. Colonel Munro was not the sort of man who would delude himself with vain hopes. He saw his position in its true light, and he returned to his thoughts of the past, and all its happy days and hours. How long a time was spent thus he would have found it difficult to determine. The night was still dark. No faint streak of light as yet appeared on the mountain peaks to herald the approach of dawn. It must have been about 4 a.m. when the attention of Colonel Munro was arrested by a most singular phenomenon. Whilst living that past inner existence, he had no eyes for anything near him. Scenes of other days were before him. Exterior objects, indistinctly seen in the gloom, had no attraction for him, when suddenly his eyes became conscious of something that caused the vision called up by his imagination totally to vanish. In fact, the colonel was no longer alone on the esplanade of Raipur. A wavering light had all at once appeared toward the end of the path, near the postern of the fortress. It went to and fro, now dim, now bright, one moment almost extinguished, the next resuming its brilliancy, as if held in an insecure hand. In the prisoner's position, every incident had its importance. He watched the light intently. Observing that a smoky vapor rose from it, he concluded it was not enclosed in a lantern. "One of my companions," thought the colonel. "Gumi, perhaps, but no. He would not be there with the light to betray his presence. Who can it be?" The flame slowly advanced. It glided along the wall of the old barrack, so close, indeed, that Sir Edward feared that it would be perceived by natives sleeping within. No notice was taken. The light passed unobserved. Every now and then, when the hand that bore it waved it wildly aloft, it blazed up afresh and burned more brightly. By the time it reached the parapet and moved along the crest, like St. Elmo's fire on a stormy night, the colonel had begun to distinguish a phantom. No distinct outline, but a vague shadow flitting onwards. The being, whoever it was clothed in a long garment covering both arms and head. The prisoner did not move. He scarcely dared to breathe. He feared to terrify this apparition, or see the flame disappear in the darkness. He kept as motionless as the weighty piece of metal which held him, as it were, in its enormous jaws. In the meantime, the phantom continued to glide along the parapet. Suppose it stumbled over the body of the sleeping Hindu? No, that was not likely, for the man lay to the left of the cannon, whilst the apparition advanced from the right, stopping sometimes, but ever gradually drawing nearer. It at last came so close that Colonel Munro could see it distinctly. What he saw was a being of medium height, entirely covered by a long mantle. One hand alone was visible, bearing a lighted torch. "It is some madman," thought the colonel, who was so accustomed to visit the Coits' encampment that they take no notice of him. "Why hasn't he a dagger in his hand instead of a torch? Perhaps I should be able—" It was not a madman, and yet Sir Edward had nearly guessed aright. This was the mad woman of the Nabura Valley, the unconscious creature who for the last 4 months had strayed around the vineyards, always respected and hospitably received by the superstitious goons. Neither Nana Sahib nor any of his companions knew of the part Roving Flame had taken in the attack on the Pall of Tandit. Many a time they had met her in this mountainous district of Bundokund, but her presence had never caused them any anxiety. Often had her incessant wanderings led her to the fortress of Rapport, and no one ever dreamt of driving her away. It was only by chance that her nocturnal peregrinations had brought her there that night. Colonel Munro knew nothing about this madwoman. He had never heard of Roving Flame, and yet as this unknown being approached, and was about to touch and perhaps speak to him, his heart beat with unaccountable violence. Little by little the madwoman drew near the cannon. Her torch burned dimly. She did not appear to see the prisoner, although she was face to face with him, and her eyes were visible through openings like holes in the hood of a penitent. Sir Edward did not stir. Neither by word nor by gesture did he seek to attract the attention of the strange being. At last she turned and flitted round the huge gun, the light she carried casting little wandering shadows over its surface. Did the poor bewildered brain know the use of this gun, standing there like a monster, that a man was bound to its mouth, and that, at first morning beam of light, it would vomit forth a fearful burst of thunder and lightning? Far from it. Roving Flame was there as she might be anywhere, quite unconscious. She wandered about tonight as she had done many a time before on the esplanade. Then she would probably leave the spot, glide down the winding path to the valley, and thence stray wherever her fancy took her. As Colonel Munro could freely turn his head, he followed all her movements. He saw her pass round the gun and direct her steps in the direction of the postern. Suddenly Roving Flame stopped only a few paces from the sleeping native and turned. Some invisible power seemed to draw her forward, some unaccountable instinct brought her back to the colonel, and again she stood motionless before him. Sir Edward's heart beat vehemently, as though it would burst from his bosom. Roving Flame moved yet nearer. She raised her torch to a level with the prisoner's face, as though the better to see him. Nothing of her own face was visible except her eyes, and they were brilliant with a feverish fire. Colonel Munro gazed intently, as if fascinated. The left hand of the strange being gradually drew back the folds of its garment until her face was exposed to view, and at the same time she shook the torch until it blazed afresh and threw a bright light around. A half-stifled cry broke from the prisoner. "Laura! Laura!" He thought he must be going mad himself. He closed his eyes for a moment. Then again he looked at her. It was Lady Munro. It was his wife who stood before him. "Laura, you! Is it you?" he stammered. Lady Munro answered not a word. She did not recognize him. She did not even appear to hear him. "Laura, mad! Yes, mad, but living." Sir Edward could not have been deceived by a mere resemblance. The image of his wife was too deeply graven on his heart. Sadly changed, but still beautiful, was Lady Munro, and even after 9 years of a separation which her husband had deemed eternal, he knew her to be his wife. This poor lady, after doing all in her power to defend her mother, slain before her eyes, had herself fallen wounded, but not mortally. She was one of the last thrown into the well of Cawnpore on the heap of victims already filling it. When night fell, the instinct of self-preservation caused her to struggle up the margin of the well. Instinct alone, for reason had fled at the horror of those awful scenes. After all she had suffered from the commencement of the siege, in the prison of the Bibigar, and at the massacre, finally seeing her mother slain had driven away her senses. She was mad, quite mad, but living, Just as Monroe had said, crazed, she had dragged herself out of the well and had wandered away and left the town, as did Nana Sahib and his followers after the bloody execution. Mad, she had escaped in the darkness through the country, avoiding town and inhabited districts, received by the poor ryots, and respected by them as a being deprived of reason. The poor creature had roamed onward until she reached the Satpura Mountains, and then the Vindhyas. Dead to everyone for 9 years, crazed by the horrors she had witnessed, she wandered incessantly, unable ever to rest. And this was she. Colonel Monroe called again. No answer. Oh, what would he not have given for power to fold her in his arms, carry her, fly with her, and commence a new life at her side. With the care and the great love he would lavish on her, reason could surely be won back. But what vain fancies were these? Was he not powerless, bound to this mass of metal, his limbs cut and numb with tightly drawn cords, utterly unable to stir, in spite of all of his wild longing to tear her away from that accursed spot? What torture, what agony was that? Far beyond even what Nana Sahib's cruel imagination could have conceived. Ah, if that demon had been there, if he had known that Lady Monroe was in his power, what horrible joy he would have felt. With what refinement of cruelty he could have increased the sufferings of his prisoner. "Laura! Laura!" repeated Sir Edward, raising his voice even at the risk of arousing his guard, sleeping but a few steps distant, or the dacoits in the old barrack, or Nana Sahib himself. Neither comprehending him nor seeing who he was, Lady Monroe kept her wild eyes fixed on the colonel's face. She understood nothing of the frightful torture inflicted on him at thus finding his wife again, only when he himself had but an hour to live. She shook her head slightly, as though she had no wish to reply. A few minutes passed like this. Then her hand sunk down, her mantle fell again over her face, and she drew back a step or two. She was leaving him. "Laura!" cried once more the agonized husband, as though he were bidding her a last farewell. But no, it was evidently not yet her intention to leave the esplanade. The situation, already so dreadful, was now to be aggravated in a terrible degree. Lady Monroe stopped. The cannon had attracted her attention. Perhaps it awoke in her darkened mind some shadowy recollection of the siege of Cawnpore. At any rate, she slowly returned. The hand which held the torch cast the light over every part of the gun. The smallest spark falling on the touch-hole would take instant effect. Must he then die by that hand, the one in all the world most dear to him? The thought was too awful to be endured. Far better were it to perish before the eyes of the Nana and his men. He must shout and arouse his executioners. Suddenly, from the interior of the cannon, he felt a hand grasp his. Yes, it was true. A friendly hand was busy at the cords. Then he became aware that a sharp blade was carefully cutting between the knots and his wrists. By some miracle a liberator was near him, in the very heart of the instrument of death. One by one the cords were severed. In a second it was done. He took a step forward. He was free. All his self-command was required to restrain himself. The least sound would be certain ruin. From the mouth of the piece issued a hand. Monroe grasped it. With an assistance, a man struggled forth and fell at his feet. It was Gumi. After his escape from Kalagani, this faithful servant had followed the road to Jubalpur, instead of returning to the lake towards which Nasim's band was proceeding. On reaching the path to Raipur, he had been obliged to conceal himself a second time on meeting a party of natives. From his hiding-place he overheard them speaking of Colonel Monroe, who was to be brought by the dacoits, headed by Kalagani, to the fortress, where Nana Sahib had determined his death should take place. Unhesitatingly, Gumi crept cautiously up the winding path and reached the then-deserted esplanade. There the heroic idea occurred to him that he could creep into the huge gun, hoping to save his master if it were possible, and if not, to die with him. "Day is breaking," whispered Gumi. "We must fly." "And Lady Monroe?" murmured the colonel, pointing to the motionless figure now standing with her hand resting on the breech of the gun. "In our arms, master," answered Gumi, asking no explanation. It was too late. As the colonel and Gumi approached to seize her, the poor lady, to escape them, leaned across the gun. A spark fell from her torch, and a terrific roar, echoing from cliff to cliff of the vineyards, filled the valley as with a burst of thunder. End of chapter 12.